So we're going to take a short trip to Puget Sound and talk a little bit about the outcomes from the 2013 Puget Sound Science Enterprise Workshop on the role of science in ecosystem recovery. I'd like to invite Joel Baker to come up and talk about that workshop. Many of the Delta Science Program staff participated in that workshop, and possibly you've heard about it. Let's see. So Dr. Joel Baker is the science director at the Center for Urban Waters at the University of Washington. He also holds the Port of Tacoma Chair in Environmental Science. His research interests center around the transport of organic contaminants in the environment, specifically atmospheric transport and deposition, aerosol chemistry, the dynamics of contaminant transport in estuaries, and modeling the exposure and transfer of chemicals in aquatic food webs. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. Thanks to all of you for coming back after the break. So I'm going to describe the results of a workshop that we held up in Seattle about 3 or 4 years ago now. But before I do that, I think I want to recognize that this is the transition into the discussion stage that Tracy Collier is going to run. So I wanted to just throw out a couple of thoughts and some kind of big ideas when I think about these ecosystem restoration programs. And the first question I would kind of put into the air for you to mull over is recognizing there's this dynamic tension between those who think we know what the problems are and what the solutions are, and it's just a matter of effort, right? So, do we really know what it takes, and we're just not doing enough of it? That's one camp. The other camp is we have no idea how to fix the problem, so we need to do the research, we need to do adaptive management, we need to figure this out. And at least in Puget Sound and the other systems I've worked in, there's always that tension there, right? There's oftentimes, we don't need to study this, we just need to fix it, right? Versus we don't quite know which of these problems is most important. So that's something to think about. The other question I would throw out is are we really trying to fix ecosystems, or are we trying to fix institutions and people that cause the ecosystem to be degraded? And I'll say more about that in a minute. I've been fortunate in my career to work in 3 of these large ecosystems. I started in the Great Lakes quite a while ago when Lake Erie had a phosphorus problem. Now, apparently Lake Erie has a phosphorus problem. So not much has changed there, but and then I spent 20 years working in the Chesapeake Bay system. So I was glad to see that we've recovered the striped bass in the Chesapeake. And for the last 7 or 8 years, I've been working in the Puget Sound system. So I have a bit of a perspective on how these different ecosystems work. And a few years ago, when we were working through some of the planning with the Puget Sound Partnership that you heard about earlier today, I thought it'd be fun to get to the science directors for what EPA calls the large aquatic ecosystems around the country together for a workshop, and that's what I'll describe to you. One of the interesting notes is the EPA had never gotten the science directors for all of their large aquatic ecosystems in one room deliberately, and in fact, they were a little bit nervous about the idea, like, why would you want to do that? Fearing, I think, that people are going to start trading notes about about what works and doesn't work with EPA. So we did have a group get together, and I want to talk to you a little bit about the outcomes from that. None of this is going to be new to you. The broad message here is that the similarities among these ecosystems, although the ecosystems are radically different from Puget Sound to the Everglades, the similarities of the problems and the issues and the approaches are remarkably the same. So there's a lot of commonality among the people in this room, and I think it's fantastic that organizations get people from different ecosystems together to talk about this. But there's certainly more that binds us together than separates us. So I'm going to go forward, and the 2 options are up or down. Down. Thank you. So as mentioned earlier, I'm the director of something called the University of Washington Puget Sound Institute. We created this as a cooperative agreement with EPA 7 years ago now, largely because I recognized in the 25 plus years I've been doing this that the interface between science and policy doesn't just happen organically, and it doesn't just happen on the weekends and at night. You have to have a very deliberate structure to make sure that this kind of interaction happens. So our core mission is to support targeted research to address key uncertainties, but more importantly, to synthesize and integrate research findings into policy-relevant guidance. I think most ecosystems probably have far more science laying around in reports and in databases and in theses and dissertations and in published papers that hasn't been pulled together than you care to admit. So we spend a lot of time not doing new research, but just digging up old reports and trying to make some sense of them. And then we spent a lot of time in communication, and we've already heard about that from others today. Is that going to work if I did that? I guess not. I got to go up, down. Damn it. Down. What's it down? That makes no sense at all. All right. So we put together this workshop, and there's the workshop goals, largely the similar goals to what you're doing here. One to cross-calibrate among large aquatic science programs, and a lot of the same questions that you were trying to address here, like how much money do you spend on science in your system? What fraction of that is of the total? Does that seem about right to you? How does all that work? Certainly discovering what's working in these programs and what's not working, moving towards best practices, largely trying to not to make the same stupid mistakes that each ecosystem, going around and around. This question about, are you doing enough science? And I'm not even sure I understand what that means, but is science, is your program, do you describe it as science-based, science-informed, whatever term you use, do you feel that that's right? Do you feel that the science is sufficient in magnitude, and is it being plugged in and used in the right ways, which I guess now we call that, do you have a science enterprise, which at the time we didn't think to call it science enterprise. Down, right? And one of the things I think hopefully will come out of this meeting, it didn't really, we kind of dropped the ball on that last point. I think it'd be fantastic if we had established a peer network of those of us who, the scientists and the science program leaders in the large ecosystems working together. Get together every year or so, have a beer, kibitz about what's going on, and having these kinds of conversations. So some sort of enduring structure would be nice coming out of this. So, boy, here's the topics we covered at our workshop, very similar to the topics that you're covering here. How do we set priorities in the face of uncertainty? How do we use adaptive management, or how do we make management adaptive? What's the most effective institutional structure for recovery? All right, you've heard this, right? This is not new. How should social sciences advance recovery? And I'll say more about that in just a minute. And then how do we effectively communicate science to decision makers? So nothing radically different than what you've been hearing so far today and for the rest of this workshop. And we did what you did, which is together, kind of look at the map and say, where are the large ecosystems? Now, interestingly, since we were supported by EPA, our first instinct was to go to EPA's large aquatic ecosystem program, and this is the list that we gathered together. Slightly different list, but lots of overlap, and many of you are participating in our workshop as well. So these are the groups we had represented in our workshop. And here's my interpretation of the large findings from the workshop. Target setting is common to all systems, right? All systems have goals, have targets, have benchmarks, call them slightly different things, but there's always this sense of we need to define a few things and work towards them. But one of the interesting things that came out, and you've seen it quite a bit today already, is this dichotomy, or this different models between different strategies, really. Do you have one or two goals and really laser focus in on that? So the Chesapeake, when I was there, was nutrients. It wasn't even nutrients, it was nitrogen, right? It was just nitrogen, nitrogen, nitrogen. We could fix the nitrogen problem, everything else would take care of itself. Heard an interesting case in the Louisiana coast where they kind of went through the exercise of generating a lot of different goals. I think they had a fairly nice handful of goals, and it became difficult to communicate. And it seemed pretty complicated. We need to prioritize our goals. And finally, through some modeling work, they were able to show, if we recover land, or at best keep the land from eroding away, a lot of this other stuff is going to come along for that ride, right? So in terms of communicating, let's just talk about, let's not lose land, or let's make more, let's solve the erosion problem, and that covers a lot of other things. So there's some advantages of having a narrow set of targets, and you can think through that. Downside is you potentially have the perception, at least, you're leaving people behind, because I'm choosing this target of 10 things that could possibly be true. Maybe half the people in your consortium get up and walk out on you because you're not, you just said their thing's not important. The flip side is, I think that in the Puget Sound is the poster child for this, is to have a diverse portfolio of targets. Scott Redmond showed our famous wheel of fortune, wheel of vital signs. 18, 24, I forget the number, and I work this every day. Large number of targets, Obviously covers the waterfront, includes human well-being, which I think is an important aspect of this. But the downside is then the policymakers can look at it and say, which one of these should we work on? And you say, well, kind of all of them. And they don't like that answer. So we spent a fair bit of time talking about target setting. And I was impressed looking across the ecosystems how variable the approach was to, or how variable the result was to the approach of target setting. The other common thing, another common theme that came out was that models, broadly defined, are really indispensable recovery tools. And we heard lots of examples, we've heard that today, of how if you have the models that provide you with a way to contextualize the information that you're gathering, identify data gaps and all the things that you know about, a great way to communicate causal relationships between stressors and responses. One of the things that I didn't really think about, an advantage of modeling that came to us from the Chesapeake program, Rich Patuk, many of you know from the Chesapeake, was at our workshop, and he made the point that models for him as a program manager were really valuable as a programmatic tool, because it allowed him to evaluate and communicate when new science information would be needed and when it would be sort of ingested by this big machine, right? You could say, I have a graduate student who really wants to work on this one process, and you could say, well, we ran the model and that process might be interesting to you, but it doesn't look like it has much impact, so we're going to downweight that. Or you can say, wow, yeah, our model's real sensitive to that. So it's an important piece to get to. Updating the model in the Chesapeake, they told us, also helped them programmatically think about staging different science aspects, so that you could say, this year we're really going to focus in on fixing the hydrology, next year is going to be the food web. So it kind of teed up when different parts of the program could spin up. Okay, so adaptive management, and hopefully I won't offend too many people with this discussion, but we had this at the time, and maybe it's still so, adaptive management was a pretty hot thing. Everyone's doing adaptive management, right? So, and this may have been why EPA didn't want us to get everyone in the same room and talk about this, because the short version was that if you asked them the question, are you doing adaptive management, they all said yes. And we said, well, how do you know that? And they said, well, our bosses told us to do it, and we told our bosses that we were doing it. And then after a little bit of, are you really doing adaptive management? No, we're not. We don't actually even really know what it is. I'm kidding. I think it's adaptive management is commonly used at the project scale, right? This is where it comes from. What hasn't happened, and I would challenge you to come up with a counterexample, is adaptive management at the ecosystem scale. So these big scale projects. We'd like to draw this circular diagram, right, where we act and monitor and all that kind of stuff. It's a good description of what you would like to do, but no one has really ever actually done it. So I'll leave that as a challenge to you for your discussion with Tracy here in a little bit. Social sciences. So how many in the room are natural scientists? Yeah, okay, see, here's the problem. Me too, by the way. So social sciences has been neglected to date. I was fortunate in the Puget Sound program to run across, I had an excellent social scientist walk into my office one day and said, can I work for you? I have NSF funding, I'm completely supported. Can I work for you? I'm a social scientist. Answer is yes. Kelly Biedenwig is her name. She's now on faculty at Oregon State. And she brought to us this really rich understanding of what social sciences can do for you as an ecosystem restoration program. And the answer is, there's the obvious answer, right? Social sciences can help you market and with changing hearts and minds. And once the natural scientists figure out how to fix the problem, the social scientists can help you convince people that the natural sciences have figured out the problem. That's one way to view natural science, social sciences in restoration. That's how natural scientists think of social sciences in restoration. That's not the best way to think of social sciences, and you can really tick them off if you do that. Just so you know. So what social sciences, okay, so a couple of points. First of all, social sciences are not a monolithic group of people any more than natural scientists are a monolithic group of people. I discovered in one of our first workshops, if you sit anthropologists and sociologists at the same table, like a cat fight breaks out. There's some reason anthropologists are anthropologists, not sociologists, and vice versa. So there's a lot of different. When we say social sciences, so it's everything from sociology, political science, economics. I mean, it's a very broad swath of stuff. So a lot of diversity there to think about. And social sciences are not outreach, right? Another way to tick them off is say, oh, you run an outreach program, you're a social scientist. So what does social scientists really do? Social scientists study us. They study institutions, they study how people work together as organizations and as individuals. And as you saw all of the org charts that were shown today, those would drive institutional analysis folks nuts, right? But they've, not to criticize you, but they've grown up organically, right? Why does your program have the structure it does? Well, it started with the Clean Water Act in 1970, and we had this act, and we did this, we did that, and we had this gamish, right? This big thing, and that's our program. Institutional analysis and social scientists can look at how your organization is built and tell you whether it's optimal to what you're trying to do. Right? We hardly ever do this in restoration programs. So it's something for you to think about that came out of our workshop. I was thinking social scientists were going to help us market our great ideas. They're actually much smarter than that. And you should involve the social scientists early on in the process. Great. Okay. Communicating science to policy and decision makers, one of the things that came out of our workshop, and is probably not a surprise to you, is often, we ask the question, when does this really work well? When do you feel like there's a great communication pathway between the science community and the elected officials or politicians? And it's almost always because of individual people, right? Either a scientist or two that are super good communicators, or a legislator who's either trained as a scientist or not turned off by science to begin with, and is willing to make that connection. So it's really a person-to-person or small group-to-small group interaction where it works well. Hard to build that into your system, but you should recognize it and encourage it when it happens. And one of the things we spent a fair bit of time talking about was managing the expectations. This problem of how do you communicate uncertainty, the science community needs to be able to say to the policymakers, you have enough information to act on, but we need to learn from it, right? We're going to do an experiment, right? Never say to a politician you're doing an experiment with their money. We know exactly what we're doing. So learning while doing is a tough concept for politicians to deal with. And then this well-known thing, the pace of ecosystem response, right? We have to be able to communicate. Yeah, we want you to do a heavy lift politically, make an action. It's going to take a decade to see a change in the environment. Another tough message for communicating policy. So I'll stop. So the final thoughts are, as I started, we all have the different systems have different origins, structures, histories, cultures. But despite that, the commonalities among the restoration programs far exceed these differences. So we should really embrace that and take advantage of it. I think there's a huge upside, in fact, almost a demand. We're not going to get this right unless we really seriously engage social sciences in a smart way. So hopefully when we have this meeting in a few years now, when we raise hands, half the people in this room will be social scientists. You need to, and I tried this at the University of Washington, it's not so easy, you need to walk into the social science departments and start talking to them about this stuff. Turns out they're not that good at it either. So we're gonna have to build, but there's no history of it, right? We're gonna have to build, it's kind of a long slog to build social scientists who are smart about participating in ecosystem restoration projects. So that's a bit of a infrastructure, human capital thing to work on. And then the final thing I'll leave you with is think about the programs that are successful. Long-term continuity in people, programs, approaches at the ecosystem scale is really, really important to restoration, to success of programs. Earlier we saw photographs of people who have been working in Louisiana for decades, right? That is such an invaluable resource. We need to find ways to encourage that. Usually underappreciated and therefore under-resourced, i.e. not funded. Keeping monitoring programs, playing the long game here is really a challenge. So I will stop there, and if we have time, we'll take any questions.
Any questions? Bruce, there's a mic coming for you.
So great talk. Thank you for sharing. I'm just curious how you use the information you got from this workshop going forward with the Puget Sound program.
Yeah, I would say it helped us inform how we were structuring some of the programs that were evolving within the Puget Sound Partnership, the state agency, which was kind of growing up at the same time. We were able, based on what came out of the workshop, to encourage the creation of a social science work group. So it's hardwired within the Puget Sound Partnership as a thing. I'm not as happy, so we got them in the tent, right? but the social scientists are all now in their own little work group, and they meet and talk about their stuff. So we're not quite there yet. So that's one example of it. I would say that we didn't do a good job we didn't make a lot of progress on figuring out like how big your program should be or what the best organizational structure is, which is what you're wrestling with here. Had a good conversation, but I can't say that really actually changed our program, because it was pretty much already started.
One more question?
Uh-oh, my colleague.
Ken Currens, Northwest Indian Fisheries Commission, and I'm from the Puget Sound. Joel, great summary, I think, of what went on in that workshop. I was a little surprised at that workshop, and even more surprised now that there's no mention of these systems, these social ecological systems, as being complex.
Yeah.
When do we start talking about these things as being complex systems as opposed to complicated systems? This still looks like we're trying to model and study our way out of the problem. Mm-hmm. And is this? You said this is part of the discussion period, so I'm just teeing this up here for you or someone else to chew on.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. Because we do confuse complicated with complex, right? And part of that's communication, because I think that the policymakers understand complexity because they deal with things that are far more complex than ecosystems, right? I think. But there's this tension between needing to boil it down to something fairly simple versus embracing the complexity that it is. And I think that the example out of Louisiana and some work I'm aware of, the best way I've seen this handled are where you capture all of the fine detail and you really do get down in the weeds. And you build super complex models that cover everything, but you got to do that to get it right. And then you build a front end that looks really simple for the policymakers. So I'm not quite sure I'm ready to go to coloring the lakes red, green, and yellow. That's I don't know if I'm there yet. But the point, the front end of the model can have a very simple output. That doesn't mean you have a simple model or a simple description of the system, but it does mean that you bury that complexity so that you don't turn off the people you're trying to talk to. But I think we all know that the complexity of the system is what makes the system what it is. And I'm afraid we have too much of it, and I'm trained as an engineering approach of deconstructing everything down to individual pieces and figuring those out and then hoping we can put it back together again, which has failed. Failed medical science, it'll fail ecosystem sciences as well.
All right. Thanks so much.